Here's the thing. If you can't spot the sucker within your first hour at the poker table, then the sucker is you. You may have heard this saying before. It is a pretty popular axiom in the world of professional poker. It's even the opening line of the hit poker movie Rounders starring Matt Damon. But it does kind of beg a question. How exactly does one spot a sucker? Welcome to the Tavern Poker Podcast. I'm Steve Wannall, your poker guru, and I am here to help you answer just that question. Because this episode's topic for discussion is how to read poker tells. Well, let's start off by identifying what exactly a tell is. The simplest definition, I think, is that a tell is any kind of physical or verbal behavior that might give you some kind of a clue as to what a person is thinking. And interestingly enough, a lot of these behaviors seem to be shared by most people. That being said, while there is a finite number of them, there are a whole lot of poker tells. And some are certainly more reliable than others. But how important is it really to be able to read tells at a poker table? To be able to look into someone's soul and determine if they're lying or not? Well, a lot of people get put off of the game of poker for precisely this reason, because they're worried that they won't be able to figure it out. It can seem like a really daunting task to try and observe someone's body language all the time and determine if they're lying to you or not. But fear not, because while reading someone's body language and trying to pick up tells is a part of the game of poker, it's not really as big a part of the game of poker as most people would believe. And it doesn't have to be intimidating, or even all that difficult. After all, trying to get a read on somebody is just another tool for you to have in your arsenal. And there are a lot of misconceptions about reading tells that are usually perpetuated by things like Hollywood, where poker is often portrayed as a game that is almost exclusively about reading people. And in those settings, reading tells is almost always portrayed as something truly spectacular, or painfully obvious, something that requires a great deal of skill from whoever the hero of the scene is. Who could ever forget that moment in Casino Royale when James Bond figures out that the villain Le Chiffre always strokes the scar by his eye whenever he's bluffing? Or later on when Le Chiffre figures out that James Bond saw it and uses that same tell against him? Or the tremendously telegraphed moment in the aforementioned movie Rounders, where the character Teddy KGB, played with a delightfully horrible Russian accent by John Malkovich, kept a chip tray full of Oreos at the table, and twisted and cracked them apart and ate them one at a time whenever he had a strong hand. Well, the reality of it is, tells are never going to be that obvious. No one is just going to hand you a perfect read like that on a silver platter. In a real game, tells are much more subtle. But they are always completely unconscious. At least the real ones are. You do have to be on the lookout for someone putting on a show. And it is for these reasons that reading people, trying to pick up tells, is, as I said, not as big a part of the game as most people would believe. But it's important to know them all the same, if for no other reason than to figure out when you might be giving off some of these tells. Because giving your opponents free information is never something you want to do at a poker table. Well, as I said, there are a great many poker tells that you might pick up at the poker table, far too many to list all in one sitting. But I'm going to do my best to try and go through as many of them as possible. I've compiled a great many, and I've narrowed it down to a bunch that I think are some of the more common ones. A lot of these are also tells that you might find agreed upon by many poker experts. These are tells that have been identified over the course of many years in the game of poker, and they've been observed and collected by people like behavioral analysts, FBI profilers, professional magicians, and, of course, lifelong poker players. People like Annie Duke and Daniel Negreanu, and, of course, none other than the mad genius of poker himself, Mike Caro, who was the first person to literally write the book on the subject. Now, there's a lot of ground to cover here, so I'm just going to try and dive right in and talk about some of the more obvious ones. The first one that you'll usually find is simply one that people like to call engaging. When someone engages with the game a little bit more. Well, what does that look like? Usually it means that there's an upright motion. They're suddenly paying more attention. It's when you literally see them rise. Maybe they'll suddenly start sitting closer to the table, or their whole posture will straighten up a bit. They might even stick their nose up a little bit. If they suddenly appear a whole lot more interested in the hand, it's usually because they just hit something very, very strong. It can often be a subtle gesture, and in fact, the more subtle it is, the more reliable I would say it is, because they don't realize they're doing it. It's a subtle show of confidence. They are feeling more confident, or they're simply interested in the action because they sense an opportunity. Be extremely wary if you happen to notice someone doing that. And something that you'll notice with a lot of these tells is that they all have an opposite. And this one is certainly no different. If you see someone disengage from the hand, if they suddenly just kind of sit back or maybe push their cards a little bit away from them or start looking away from the table and appearing disinterested, usually an indication that they're not very strong. And typically most tells can be broken up into these two different categories. Someone is either conveying strength or weakness. And it doesn't always have to be when you're in the hand with them. These are things that you should be looking at all the time, even when you're not involved in the hand. Because a lot of times, you're not going to get to recognize a tell unless someone is making a sudden change in their behavior. And in a tournament, it's that much more difficult because people are generally more guarded. It isn't until they've been there for a little while and they start to relax into the game that they stop paying attention to what they're doing so much, at least as far as their own physical reactions. This is why you should always be watching other players instead of watching the flop or watching the deal. You should be watching other players watch the flop or look at their cards. Because even if a person doesn't end up being involved in the hand, subtle little tells that they give off can tell you how you might be in a position to play it differently. That sort of leads us into the next tell, and that is how well they're guarding their hand. Specifically whether or not they're using a card protector. Now, a lot of pros are going to tell you that you should never use a card protector, because it's a gateway to all kinds of little physical idiosyncrasies that someone can get a read off of. Now, I don't entirely agree with this philosophy. I think it's very important to protect your cards. I happen to be of the opinion it's perfectly fine to use a card protector or to place a chip over your cards or to keep your hands on them, just so long as you understand the information that you might be giving away. The way to avoid doing that is to simply have a cadence that you use. Have a set pattern of behavior that you do on every single hand. For example, this is my own. When I get dealt the two cards, I will immediately pull them into myself without looking at them, and I will place either a chip or a card protector on top. Immediately. Again, without looking. Then I will observe the other players. Because a lot of people, once they get dealt their cards, will usually immediately take a look at them. And this is an opportune time to try and get some reactions. Only when the action comes around to me and I've had a chance to observe how other people are behaving at the table, will I then look at my cards. And I'll try to do it the same way every time. I will look at my cards for just a couple short seconds, and then I will immediately set them back down and replace the card protector. After all of the pre-flop action is then finished, I will recheck those whole cards one more time, no matter what they are, for the sole purpose of memorizing them, for burning them into my brain. Then I will place the card protector back on top of them and never look at them again. And why do I go through all of this trouble? Well, it is for the sole reason that I know that any deviation from this pattern gives away specific information. For example, say you happen to notice that someone has a card protector in front of them, but they don't always use it. A lot of times when someone is using a card protector, they'll get dealt their two cards, and they'll look at them, and then they'll immediately do one of two things. They will either pull the cards in closer to them ever so slightly and put the card protector on top of them, or they won't bother putting the card protector on top of them and they'll just hold the cards loosely, or slightly away from them. Well, obviously this means two completely different things. If the card protector goes on top of the cards, it means they intend to play. They have something good, or at least worth seeing a flop with. If the card protector doesn't go on top, and they're holding the cards slightly away from themselves, well, that's what we call telegraphing a fold. They don't like it. They don't really have any intention to play. And depending on the stakes that you're playing at, this could mean a couple of different things. Generally in low or no stakes games, it means the person's just going to send them away. They're going to fold it no matter what happens. But in slightly higher stakes games or with more savvy players, that person might just be waiting to see what the action is before they get to them. And if it checks around, if there's no action, this is a person who might actually bluff at it to try and steal the dead wood out of the pot. So then tells like that become really important as far as how you decide to play against them. And really that's what we're talking about. All of these tells exist to inform your decision of how you should proceed. Again, to use the Hollywood scenario, a character picking up a tell is almost always a pivotal plot point. It almost always happens when the hero of the story is put to a very difficult decision, and it becomes imperative to figure out if the villain in the scene is lying to them or not. But as I said before, in real life it's not usually that dramatic. In real life, picking up a tell on someone usually just tells you if you should get out of the way before the action even gets to you, or if maybe this is an opportune time for you to try and take advantage of the situation. And of course it all depends on whether or not the read you've got tells you that someone is either strong or weak. So how do you know which is which? Well, that can be a little bit tricky, because a lot of these tells do not have a high percentage of accuracy, and they all depend very greatly on the specific person that you're looking at, because everybody reacts to things differently, and it takes a little bit of observation to figure out exactly how this person behaves, and what is and is not normal for them. But generally speaking, there are certain subconscious actions that everybody shares, and so we're going to go down the line one at a time. Let's start with the things that convey strength. How do you know if a person is strong, if they have a strong hand, or if they just made their draw? Well, there are certain specific things that you should look at. Now, as far as how I play the game of poker, I'm not someone who relies a whole lot on reads. For my money, the absolute best read you can pick up on someone is simply paying attention to their betting patterns and looking for deviations in that. But there are a small handful of things that I have noticed over the years that have a shockingly high percentage of accuracy. My personal favorite is the shrug bet. If someone shrugs, even slightly, while they're placing a bet, they're almost always strong. And the reason I find this to be so reliable is that it is very subtle, but it's completely involuntary and everybody does it. They don't even realize they're doing it. If, for example, they're sitting on the button and the action checks around to them and they just kind of go, and they make a little shrug and then they reach for their chips, get out of the way. They have a strong hand. They are inadvertently, completely unconsciously trying to convey the idea that, well, I don't really have anything, but if no one else is going to bet at it, I'm just going to put a few chips in here and try and take it down, when the reality is that's not what's going on at all. They hit something. They have something. They're trying to get paid off, but they don't want to scare anybody away. And that little shrug is a completely involuntary action. So if you see it, and you don't really have anything worth calling with, just get out of the way. Similar to this are some of the noises that people might make while they're involved in a hand. If they're doing the verbal equivalent of a shrug, like a sort of dejected sigh, oh, I guess I'll bet. Or if they're making kind of smacking of their lips like, Mike Caro coined the term poker clack to describe this particular phenomenon. If they make a bet and then you hear them just kind of go, it's very, very quiet. It's very, very subtle. They don't realize they're doing it. It's another completely involuntary action to try and convey weakness when in fact they are very, very strong. Be wary of that kind of action. Another great way to determine a person's relative hand strength is by looking at their actual hands. What are their hands doing when they're holding their cards, when they're reaching for their chips, when they're making a bet? You might find yourself looking at certain players before the action even gets to them, because they're giving you all kinds of information. Before it's their turn to act, for example, are they holding chips in their hand? Or are they holding their cards? How are they holding these things? Are their hands shaking? Well, these are all things that are usually telegraphing some kind of impending action. If they're holding chips in their hand, it's very likely it's because they intend to put them in the pot. If their hands are shaking when they make a bet, or if they make a bet very slowly and deliberately and carefully, these are usually signs of strength. Now, a lot of people think that, well, if their hands are shaking, they're nervous. That means that they don't really have a strong hand, right? Well, that's not necessarily true, as it turns out. Shaking hands is usually a sign of adrenaline. It typically means they're excited about something. They know they're going to get involved in the pot. They might genuinely be nervous about it because you never know what's going to happen in a hand, but this will at least tell you that their hand is strong enough that they've decided to take the risk and play it. That specific tell is something that a lot of poker professionals seem to agree on. However, in my experience, I've discovered that you have to be very careful when you're deciding what it is that it means. Some people just naturally shake. Some people are generally nervous, or maybe they have some kind of a palsy, but shaking hands is not really going to be all that uncommon, and it doesn't always mean what you think it means. It's really if you happen to notice it and it is out of the ordinary for that person. That's when you should be paying attention. And that's sort of true of all these tells. And in addition to watching their hands, you can also get a read off of their feet. Now, I know it's difficult to see people's feet when you're sitting at the poker table, but you can get a general idea from their body language of what's happening to them below the table. As at least one poker professional has said, feet never lie. Specifically if someone is bouncing their leg or maybe locking their feet around the legs of the table or something. This is what we call happy feet. Annie Duke described it as a dog wagging their tail. When people get excited about something, they usually have a difficult time physically containing their excitement, and this lets itself out in their legs. So if you see someone bouncing a leg, it's usually that same kind of adrenaline that leads to shaking hands. It means they're being impatient. They can't wait for the action to get to them, or they can't wait for the hands to be revealed so they can drag in a big, huge pot. Be very careful if you happen to notice someone doing this. It'll be easier to pick that up when someone's sitting right next to you, of course. Much more difficult if they're sitting across the table from you. But again, you can read their body language and sort of get an idea. There are, of course, a lot more signs to tell when a person is holding something really, really strong. But the last one I'd like to talk about here is where they're looking. Of course, where a person is looking while they're sitting at the poker table can give you a myriad of other tells. But this one is pretty specific. It's when they look at their cards and then where they look next. Once they've glimpsed their whole cards, or they take a look at the flop, where is the next place that they look? Well, if a person is strong, a lot of times they will involuntarily look to the chips. They'll look immediately to the chips that are already in the pot, or they'll look at their own chip stack. This is an indication that they're thinking about the money and not the hand anymore. That usually means they want to bet. They're calculating how much they can win, because they believe they're strong enough to win the hand. It's especially effective if you happen to notice someone take a look at the cards and then quickly glimpse at the chips either in the pot or in their chip stack, and then look away from the table as though they're disinterested. Now you gotta be really careful, because they're giving off a huge sign of strength, all while, of course, trying to look like they're actually pretty weak or not interested in the hand at all. Which brings us to the next set of tells. These are ones that convey weakness. These are all tells that if you happen to pick up on them, this might be the time to pounce on your prey. And the first one I want to talk about in this section is freezing. Now, freezing means precisely that. They're stopping. They're just stopping all action. They're suddenly stopping everything they've been doing up until this point. Now, unlike telegraphing what they're going to do before the hand gets to them, this is usually something that happens after they've made a bet. It's almost always an indication that they are bluffing. So when a person is actually confident, they'll look relaxed at the table. They might sit back and fold their arms in their chair, or rock back and forth, or do one of the things we just said, like bounce their leg. But when someone's actually weak, they don't want to be noticed. They're trying to become invisible. And so they're going to sort of shrink in on themselves. They're going to stop all motion. They might even stop breathing. If they're doing something like chewing gum or snacking on chips or nuts or something, eating their dinner, they'll stop chewing. They don't want you to get any kind of read on them at all, because they're terrified that if you do pick up something, you'll realize that they're bluffing, when the reality is they're already telling you everything you need to know. By giving you nothing, they might just be giving you everything. And again, it's important to note that this is something that's only reliable if it's a change from their normal behavior. If this is how they act on every single hand with every single bet, it's going to be much more unreliable. But if this is something that's abnormal for them, when they suddenly freeze after making a big bet, chances are they're bluffing you. And this sort of bleeds into another one of my favorite tells, which is when someone starts covering their face. Now, you'll see a lot of people do this at the poker table. You'll see people grab a collar of their shirt and hold it up over their mouth, or maybe they'll make a bet and then they'll sort of put their hand up on their forehead and kind of hide their eyes from you, or they'll cover their mouth completely with their hand. Some people will even throw a hoodie on and zip it up really tight and try and recede into themselves. They're trying to hide from you so that you can't get a read on them. Well, again, it's not always the case, but very often this can convey weakness. They don't want you to get any kind of read on them, because then you'll discover that they're lying. These are things to look for after they've made a big bet. And it's really important to note once again that these should be subtle actions to look for. If they're making a big, huge show about it, well, that's less reliable. Often if someone's doing a conscious tell, they're putting on an acting job, well, as a professional actor, I can tell you that actors are generally not very good poker players because we tend to overact. If we're putting out a false tell deliberately, it's usually pretty easy to see right through it. Because we're not acting to entertain people, we're actually trying to fool them, and that requires a lot of subtlety. It requires knowing exactly what the unconscious behaviors that people typically do are so that you can portray them convincingly. And of course, it also requires your audience to understand what it is they're looking at, which is often not the case. One of my favorite things I witnessed was a televised event where someone made a big, huge move all in, and then they zipped up their jacket, threw on a hoodie, put some sunglasses on, and they pulled their legs up into their chair up to their chest, and they tried to hide. They put on such a show of hiding from someone. The idea was, oh, you're not going to get a read on me, when, they were giving so many different tells in that hand, they could not have been more obvious. And you'll see that kind of thing all the time. But generally speaking, if it's a subtle move that they're trying to hide their face, that's conveying some kind of weakness. It often means that they're bluffing. And sometimes the reason that they're hiding their face is because, at least on a subconscious level, they're aware that other tells do exist that you can give away with your face. There are 43 different muscles in the human face, many of which react involuntarily to emotion. We give off signals and tells with our faces all the time without knowing it. And these are things that a savvy player can look for at the poker table. For example, if a player is doing a lot of blinking, this usually betrays the weakness of their hand. They're showing some nerves here. Blinking is generally a sign that someone is lying. It's very hard to control your face when you're lying, and blinking is one of the strongest signs. Also, if someone happens to be moving their lips, pursing their lips, licking the inside of their lips with their tongue while their mouth is closed, all signs of weakness. Now, a lot of times people will think that, we can look to see if their eyes are dilating too. If someone's eyes are dilating after all, it's usually because they're trying to let in more light. That means they like what they're looking at, which is something that conveys strength, but I don't like to bring that up really in the context of poker tells, because that is a very, very difficult thing to see at the poker table. A lot of people think that's why poker players wear sunglasses at the table. That's really not the reason to wear sunglasses at all. There isn't much of a reason to wear sunglasses, to be perfectly honest. I have worn them at the table before, but it's never because I think people are getting a read on me or looking to see if my eyes are dilating. It's always because I don't want other people to see where I'm looking when I'm staring at them to try and pick up a tell. But I digress. The point I'm making is you can take a look at their face and see how it reacts to certain things. If a face is relaxed, so is the person. If their face sort of tightens up a bit, if they start squinting or scowling or perhaps, again, pursing their lips in some way, then this is conveying a lot of nervousness, which generally means weakness. And being nervous over having a weak hand, or a hand that is at least not as strong as they would like it to be, is something that can lead to other physical tells as well. For example, something that people like to call self-soothing, or little fidgeting actions that you can look at from their whole body, really. If you see someone drumming their fingers or fidgeting in their seat, this is different from having happy feet. It's not the same as like an excited bouncing leg. This is if they're kind of fidgeting around, maybe flicking their cards back and forth or playing with their chips a little bit in sort of a nervous fashion, or maybe they're actually stroking their leg with their hand or petting their back of their hand or something. This is literally a self-soothing action. It means they're trying to calm themselves. And of course, they don't realize they're doing it. These are just subtle little actions that all of us tend to do on a daily basis without realizing it. It's like hugging yourself. These self-soothing actions are things that you can look at and maybe interpret as they have a weak hand. This might be a time to try and bluff them out of a pot, or to come over top of a bet that they just made. You can also determine a person's relative weakness by paying attention to how they place their bets. And there are two specific things I'd like to discuss here as far as that's concerned. The first one is a very specific situation that happens when someone places a bet in a big stack of chips and it falls over. Or maybe the bet ends up being just a little more messy than they originally intended. Well, if that person will then try and fix the bet, if some chips fall off the top of their stack and they grab them and they put them back on top of the stack when they're making a bet, well, that generally means it's pretty weak, or they're at least nervous about making that bet. They're not entirely certain where they stand. This again goes back to the idea that they don't want to draw any attention to themselves. They're subconsciously doing this. They want everything to look perfect so that there's no reason to question it. So if they're trying to fix things, little mistakes that they've made while they're making their actions, that kind of fastidiousness betrays weakness. And sometimes, every now and then, you can sort of manipulate this and try and get them to show that weakness to you. Let's say you're involved in a hand and you have a fairly decent hand, or at least a decent draw, and you'd like to see another card cheaply, or maybe you think that you can win this but you're not entirely sure. You really need to get a read on someone. And the someone you need to get a read on is the person who's seated directly to your right. And the action is now on them. And that player goes to make a bet. You see them reach for their chips and start to push a stack forward. Well, there's a little action you can take to try and get a read on them, to try and force a tell out of them. If when they start to make that bet, you then quickly reach for your chips to try and convey that you're going to call, or maybe even raise them, notice how they react to that. If they don't pay any attention at all and they just smoothly make their bet, chances are they actually have something. But if they hesitate, if they notice you reach for your chips and there's even a split second of hesitation, they might not be as strong as they're trying to let on. And that's a good indication that you should either call that bet or even raise them. Now, this doesn't always work, obviously, and there are quite a few players who are actually aware of this technique. It's something that you should use sparingly against people who you might actually catch off guard. I've tried it a few times, and I haven't really had a whole lot of success with it. But it's important to note that this is something that you can do. You can even notice when other people do it when you're not involved in a hand. It'll give you a general idea of how a person behaves, and that's always something that you can use to your advantage. So we've talked about tells that convey strength. We've talked about tells that show weakness. Now I'd like to talk about one that's sort of in a gray area in between them. This is a tell that might let you know that your opponent has a tough decision in front of them. And it's usually when they slow down. Now, obviously, if someone's in the tank for a long time, they're taking a long time to make a decision, well, that'll tell you, yeah, they have a tough decision in front of them. But if they're really taking their time before finally calling or just checking, that'll give you a pretty good idea of where they are in the hand. This kind of slow deliberation can help you put them on a range of possibilities. Maybe they're on a draw. Maybe they have second pair. Maybe they have top pair but with a weak kicker. You can slowly start to narrow down where they are in the hand by this kind of behavior. Now, of course, the opposite of that is if they're acting fast, if they're making a fast call or a quick check behind you. It usually means they're either on a draw, but it's not a very good one, or maybe they don't have anything at all and they just want to get to a free showdown. Now, a lot of the time, someone taking a long time to make a decision will happen if there's going to be no more action after that decision. For example, if you've just gone all in and they're trying to decide whether or not to call you, or you've made a bet that would put them all in, and they're going to go into the tank for a long time to try and figure it out. Well, generally speaking, the longer they take to make a decision, the more information they're going to give you. Now, if there's no action to be had after that, it often doesn't make any difference, but it is something that you can use for later. You can put it in the bank and remember it if they happen to still be there. Whenever I find myself in a situation where I've gone all in and there's only one person left to act and they're taking a long time deciding whether or not to call me, the longer they take to make that decision, the more comfortable I get. Now, as I said before, most poker tells have sort of an opposite to them. Call it the poker law of physics, that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And let's discuss some of those things right now. And the first of these diametrically opposed tells I'd like to discuss has to do with how a person looks at their cards. Just as I mentioned how taking a long time to make a decision or making a decision very quickly can give you some information, this is also true with how they look at their hole cards. One of the more reliable tells that a lot of people will talk about is if someone picks up their 2 hole cards to peek at them, and they end up looking at them for a long time, or at least significantly longer than they would normally glimpse their cards. If someone takes a quick look at them and then, they just seem disinterested, they're probably going to fold them. They probably don't mean a whole lot. But if someone picks up those cards and likes what they see, they're usually going to keep looking at them for a little bit longer. Someone's got pocket aces. They like looking at pocket aces. Pocket aces are pretty. You can get a read off of them in that way, especially if they then give off one of the other tells that I mentioned earlier. Also, someone who has really strong hole cards won't have to recheck them later on. They know what they have, because their hand was strong to begin with. But the opposite end of taking a good long look at those cards is when someone does have to recheck them later on in the hand. The best example of this is when 3 cards of the same suit hit the table. If someone takes a moment to recheck their hole cards after that, that is a gold mine of information for you. Now, a lot of people will think that, say, 3 spades just hit the flop and their opponent just looked at their hole cards again. They're checking to see if they hit the flush. Well, that's not usually what it means. What it usually means is that their hand contains 2 cards of 2 different suits. One of them's probably black, one of them's probably red, and they can't remember if their black card was a spade or not. So they're not checking to see if they hit the flush. They're checking to see if they're on a flush draw, because that can give them all kinds of different equity in the hand. Now again, that's not 100% reliable. Sometimes they are checking to make sure that they had the flush because they just can't believe it, but that's still information that you can use. It usually means they didn't have a super strong hand to start with, or at least not a made hand to start with. So always be on the lookout for people rechecking their cards. And like I said, I always recheck my cards, but this is for the sole purpose of memorizing them before the flop comes out, so I don't have to think about it again. I don't have to go back and look at those cards. Mike Carroll, the mad genius of poker, who literally wrote the book on poker tells, said you should never recheck your hole cards. And I have actually had people say, hey, I noticed you check your cards again. That tells me they weren't all that strong. Well, it's been in cases where I've had pocket aces, even where someone has said that to me, and I ended up fooling them, because I always recheck my cards right before the flop comes out. Again, that's the importance of having a specific pattern that you stick to. Another set of diametrically opposed tells include the stare down versus someone avoiding eye contact with you. If someone feels confident enough to stare you right in the eyes when they are making a move on you, or when they're involved in a hand with you, that usually means they're very, very strong. Unless they're doing it so deliberately and so intimidatingly that it's obviously a bluff, generally speaking, if they're staring right at you, they're confident. They feel very strongly that they're going to win the hand, and that's almost always on the basis of the strength of their hole cards. However, if someone is actively avoiding eye contact with you, it could mean the opposite. It could mean they don't want to be noticed. They have a weak hand. Again, they're receding into themselves. They're trying to become invisible. They're trying to avoid scrutiny. And again, I don't know how reliable these things are because I've heard it both ways. I've heard it if someone's staring at you after they make a bet, they're totally bluffing. If someone's looking away from the table, there are certain circumstances where they're trying to act disinterested because they are very strong, in fact. But, generally speaking, if someone is staring right at you, they're being confident. If someone's avoiding eye contact, they're weak. And this leads me to the last couple of tells that I want to talk about in this episode, and I saved them for last because they're a couple of my absolute favorites. The first of which is what I call the speech. And it's not just me that calls this, a lot of people know what the speech means. If someone is suddenly comfortable enough that they are verbalizing, if they're talking to you, if they're making a speech, if they're holding court at the table, well, that usually means they're very, very strong. They're puffing their chest up and making themselves look big and saying, hey, look at me, I'm going to win this hand. Because they probably are going to win the hand. They have something very, very strong. But you should always pay attention not just to the fact that they are speaking, but to what they're saying as well. And sometimes it can convey a different story. And my personal favorite, this is my absolute personal favorite verbal tell that I can get at the table. And because it means the opposite of strength. It means the absolute opposite. This is what I love. Say there's someone who is out of position. Maybe they're first to act in the hand after a flop. And they just check. And maybe there's a couple other people involved in the hand and they just check. And it gets to a person later on down in the action. And this person starts reaching for chips. And that first person in the line will suddenly call out, don't do it. They'll say something like, oh, I wouldn't bet at that if I were you. Well, why are they saying that? Well, they're clearly trying to intimidate someone. They're trying to influence the action. Maybe it's that same little pump fake that I mentioned earlier where they're trying to see if someone hesitates before they make that bet. But the problem is, while they might be trying to get a tell on the other person, they're also giving off a major one of their own. It means they don't have anything. It means they want to see the next card for free. They want to get to a showdown without having to commit any more chips because they don't know where they stand. They want their ace high to hold up on its own, for example. So if I happen to be in the situation where I'm the one considering a bet and someone says to me, oh, don't do it, that's a clue to me that, yes, I absolutely want to do it. And I'm going to. And this brings us to the very last tell that I want to talk about, and this is a verbal one as well, but it's one that I have heard in just about every single tournament I have ever played in, and even a couple of cash games. Now, it kind of falls into the category of opposite declarations. If someone's making a declaration at the table, then usually the opposite of what they are saying is true. And there is no greater example of that I can think of than this. It's when a person makes an all-in move and then stands up and says, well, I guess it's time for me to go home. No, it's not. No one's going to just put all their chips in because they're tired and they want to go home. Okay, sometimes, yeah, people are going to play sloppy and they're going to try and sabotage themselves. But the fact is, if someone actually wanted to go home, if they genuinely just got tired and they wanted to leave the tournament, turning your chips in is always an option. Or you can just get up from the table and leave. If they actually wanted to leave, they would. But no, that's not what they did. Instead, they made an all-in move, because what they really want is to win the hand. If someone says, well, it's time to go home, and they put their chips in, well, it's possible that they're just steeling themselves for the inevitable bad beat that will take them out of the tournament, but they still have a strong hand. They still know that they're getting it in with the best of it, or at least the best that they've seen in a while. Someone saying that they're just tired, or they just want to go home, they always have a strong hand in my experience. Always, always, always. So don't call them light. Now, I feel like I've covered a lot in this episode, but really, I've just scratched the surface. The poker tells I've talked about here are some of the more common ones, but the truth is there are hundreds, maybe even thousands of them, and a lot that are specific to the individual that you maybe never even would have considered. They're not always going to be as spectacular as what you see in the movies, but every now and then you might just be gifted with one that is. So the real moral of the story is, just pay attention to what's going on around you. You don't have to be a behavioral expert to try and pick up some of the more common tells. And the longer you play poker, the more you're going to realize what certain behaviors and certain actions mean. And in any case, it's a great game to try when you're not involved in a hand. As I've said many, many times before, one of the best ways to have poker success is to not play every single hand. You should be doing more folding than anything else, especially in a long tournament. And that is a great opportunity to still be engaged in the tournament by paying attention to the way people are acting. And above all, even if you think you can't pick up some of these tells from other people, at least be aware of them so that you can notice when you are doing it and then make a conscious effort to change your own behavior. I'm Steve Wannall, your poker guru. This has been the Tavern Poker Podcast. Please remember to like and share, subscribe to the channel, and you can even show your financial support directly by finding me on Facebook under Steve Wannall Entertainer. Every little bit helps, and I can keep churning out content. In the meantime, keep working on your poker game, and hopefully someday I'll see you at the tables. As always, thank you for listening.